From McKay Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network presents now an address by Nobel laureate Dr. Norman Borlaug, speaking in the series of Landon Lectures on public issues. To the stage now, and Kansas State University President Dr. Dwayne Walker.
Alfred M. Landon Lecture on public issues. And we especially welcome this morning those who are on campus to participate in the Agricultural History Symposium from a number of states in the United States. Our speaker today is Dr. Norman E. Borlaug, a most distinguished scientist. Currently the director of the International Wheat Research Program of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center near Mexico City. Dr. Norman Borlaug is an international authority on agricultural production and one of the world's most prominent wheat geneticists. Through his research efforts in producing new high-yielding wheat varieties, he was largely responsible for moving Mexico from a wheat importing nation to becoming the largest wheat seed exporter in the world. This he accomplished by applying common sense and hard work to solving production problems, while at the same time training on the job a corps of young Mexican scientists. The semi-dwarf wheat varieties developed by him have revolutionized wheat growing in India, Pakistan, Turkey, and now North Africa. His ability to assemble into one package all the diverse disciplines sparked a wheat revolution and earned Dr. Borlaug the title Father of the Green Revolution. He was elected to the National Academy of Science in 1968 and is a recipient of the President's Medal of Freedom. His international work and concern earned him the 1970 Nobel Prize for Peace. Today his speech is entitled Civilization Survival will depend more on flourishing crops than on flowery rhetoric. It's a great honor to present to you Dr. Norman E. Borlaug. Dr. Borlaug.
Thank you, Dr. Ocker, Dr. Litz, Mr. Milsel, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor for me to be here, and I think it's especially an honor to be in the greatest wheat-producing area in the world. Kansas is known for its fame, and not just in the USA, but everywhere we go in the world where wheat is a basic food product. And I've had the pleasure of knowing many of your people on your staff over the years, especially Dr. Elmer Heine, whom I met while we were both in graduate school at the University of Minnesota. I think your university also owes a great deal to what we take for granted today in American agriculture. You and Michigan State were the two original land-grant college and universities that came into being when President Lincoln signed the act, and you've played a key role in development of technical agriculture across all of the disciplines that impinge on the total food production of this country. You've set a pattern for many others to follow. You must remember that some of the comments that I make will probably sound very funny in the context of life in the USA. I've lived abroad for 35 years in food deficit nations, and consequently my point of view is very different than it would be had I continued to live here. So if I say some things that are shocking, please forgive me. But I hope in trying to illustrate these points I don't provoke an overkill in the sense of getting them completely out of focus. Of course, when we talk about food, it's the first basic necessity for all of us. We don't live only a few weeks at most without food. It's important to the individual. It's important to families, to keep them intact and together, and it's important to nations. The social fabric of nations falls apart when there's no food. You will remember the famines in the Sahel a few years ago in the middle 70s. 6 of those governments collapsed and were replaced by revolutionary governments of one kind or another. When stomachs go empty, patience wears out and anger flares. From the standpoint of the world also, if we're going to have world stability, it won't be done, I assure you, on empty stomachs. And so for this reason, we need to always bear in mind the importance of food. And yet in a country privileged as the USA has always been, being a large, not only producing the food we need, but exporter of tremendous quantities into world markets, it's very easy to forget the important role that it has played. How much food do we need? If we take a look at what was produced in 1975, we will see that it all totals up to about 3.3 billion metric tons. Now, this is a very diverse group of foods, beginning with the cereal grains, which are the most important and key products, all of them together, meaning wheat, maize, rice, oats, barley, sorghums and millets, and some of the minor millets, constitute about 42% of the total tonnage. But you see, since this is low moisture content compared to many of the other types of foods, it's much more than that when it comes down to calories. It includes all of the basic grain, legumes, sugars, tuber crops, nuts, fruits, vegetables of all kinds, animal products, meat, milk, eggs. So it is indeed a very diverse group of products, and they all have different moisture contents, which gives you a figure like this, but it's not too meaningful. Sometime I'd like to take all the moisture out of this and see what it boils down to in terms of actual dry weight. I've never had time to do this. You hear a lot about when the world can no longer produce the food we need on the earth, we will harvest it from the oceans and water, inland waters. And yet, if we look at the production in 1975, only 2% of the total tonnage came from the oceans and inland waters, that is fish, mollusks, and crustaceans. There must be a lot of deserts in the ocean as well. So let's not be deceived by the potential in the ocean. After World War II, the catch of fish and the shrimp, etc., went up dramatically with improved equipment for fishing, improved methods, but it leveled off at about 70 million tons and then dropped down, and it's more or less maintaining between 65 and 70 million tons. With the technology that's available now, some of the species are overfished. This means that probably other species can be added, but of the total tonnage that is taken from the ocean, about 70% goes as feed, the other 30% as, or 70% as food, the other 30% as feed, fish meal, etc. for livestock. Now, in the case of, when we think about agriculture here in the USA, since there's a big lag time between the last census and when the data are published, we're always running behind time. But the last estimate I saw by the General Accounting Office indicates that there's probably something on the order of 3.6% of the total U.S. public that lives on the land and makes its living from agriculture and animal husbandry. Compare that to the situation in most of the developing nations where 75 to 80% of the total population live on the land. And it's quite a contrast. Yet, on a worldwide basis, there's something between 46 or 7%, based on the FAO last figures, of the total world population that depends from agriculture, most of them in subsistence standards of agricultural production. Political leaders' attitude towards agriculture waxes and wanes with scarcity and abundance of food. It has been so, I would assume, from the beginning of the organization of governments, because food production itself has been very cyclic. Yet, it's a curious thing. In a country such as the United States, with its great agricultural production, there's less and less attention given to agriculture by political leaders. It's only when we have a crisis that they become interested again, and yet I had an opportunity to meet last night with many of the people here in the history symposium, and I've always been interested in history. If we look back and read about what made the United States the industrial nation that it is today, it was because it built the agricultural base first. And there was a long period of time when the United States was largely an agricultural nation. And gradually, because of its strong agricultural base, it was able to industrialize and become a strong industrial nation. Most of the new nations have to try to telescope time. They don't have all of this time because of unemployment and population pressures on the land. So other ways have to be found. And yet, there's a neglect of agriculture in the developing nations. It's generally, except when there's a food crisis on, way down at the bottom step on the social, economic, political ladder. No one's interested in agriculture. Everyone who's grown up out on the small piece of land has been miserable most of his life, and he wants out. If he has the ability to and the opportunity to obtain an education, he wants to be a medical doctor, an engineer, a chemist, or a physicist, anything but an agricultural scientist. And that's the way things are in the developing nation. The first thing that has to be done is to try to build some prestige for agriculture, for agricultural scientists. Until we can do that, we're running a very bad race, way behind, when it comes to budgeting, when it comes to all of the other things that are necessary to transform agricultural production. And in these developing nations, despite the fact that there are 75 or 80% of the people on the land, very little attention is given because those people on the land don't throw rocks and break windows and don't tip over automobiles and burn them, whereas the 15% of the people that live in the cities do this when they don't like their particular government. So that's the way this is. But I have seen a few cases recently where in 75, when there was a real shortage of diesel fuel in India, where people with their two cans, 5-gallon cans, had been waiting in line for diesel fuel for their low-lift irrigation pumps for 5 and 6 days, when finally their patience wore out, and when the tanker trucks started coming by, well, they just hijacked them and emptied them all. So that when anger is high enough, great enough, they too show some of these tendencies, if not to throw rocks, to do the equivalent there too, take the law in their own hands. And I remember vividly some of this here in the USA in the middle 30s, when I was a young man about to go to the University of Minnesota to begin my study, when the banks went broke and when the whole social system was chaotic, when the properties were being sold in sheriff sales, when neighbors came in on pitchforks and with shotguns sometimes and bought that personal property for a token of what it was really worth. But it wasn't healthy to bid for that. So let's never forget what it was like here in the middle 30s and what I continued to see in many of these other countries at the present time. I think here in a privileged country like this, and also for that matter, the consumers in the large cities in the developing nations forget about They can't comprehend the complexities and difficulties of producing the food we need. They think that food should always be cheap. I wish it were so. But they forget that there are tremendous investments in land and equipment that's required to produce that food, and the amount of labor that goes into it, and it's mostly labor in the developing nations because there's very little equipment, is important. And then, of course, the risks. The weather, for example. Doesn't rain, there's drought. Rains too much, there's floods. There are frost out of season, there are hailstorms, all of these, plus the biological risks, diseases and insects, and all of these, in the end, come out to affect our abundance of food at any particular time. Now, I mentioned that only 2% of the food that we harvest comes from the oceans, so 98% comes from the land. And most of us think of this planet Earth as a tremendous planet. But remember that more than 3/4 of it, or nearly 3/4 of it, is water. And then of the part that is land, we see that we got a lot of bad real estate. If you use the figure that FAO uses, it's about 3.4 billion hectares of land area. But only 11% of that land area is arable, so-called arable land. Then there's 22% that's some kind of pasture or range land that's used for livestock production, but much of it with low carrying capacity. And there's 30% called forest and woodlots. And again, much of that is worthless sagebrush or some other rabbit bush or creosote bush that's got one poor lonely pinyon pine or juniper for a few hundred acres, but it's still classified as forest land. And then we've got the so-called other, which is 37%. Quite a bit of that was good land at one time until we covered it up with pavement and cities and industries, and that's going on around the world at several million hectares a year, and nearly always on the best land. It seems that everybody wants to build on relatively flat land. They don't want the extra cost of building on sloping lands that are less desirable from agriculture. So the amount of land that's good and available for agriculture is being reduced faster than we add to it, for example, by irrigation or by clearing lands in some tropical areas where there are still good lands available for opening. In the past, always when there were, with growth of population, the problems were solved by opening, after a famine, opening new land, adding to the land area. This was the way agriculture production increased from the beginning of time. And it went on until after World War II, even pretty much in this country. Now, of course, the major emphasis is to produce more food on the land that's under cultivation, and this becomes particularly important in many countries densely populated that have very little opportunity to bring more land under the plow. To illustrate, countries such as India, China, People's Republic of China, Pakistan, many of the countries in the Near and Middle East and in the northern parts of Africa. Water is the limiting factor in many cases, and so there's no alternative except to improve the technology to produce more food in that way if we're going to have some semblance of order in this world in the future. If we look back just a short period, we can see these cyclic changes. After World War II, there was abundance and really overproduction from the standpoint of the U.S. farmer in the period from 1950 to 1971. About 71, everybody believed there was the right balance between the amounts of food grain that were held in stock, and it wasn't too big a burden on the American, Canadian, Australian taxpayers. And then suddenly came 72, 3, 4, and 5. 4 years of bad harvest, including sandwiching in the OPEC adjustments in petroleum prices and the shortage of fertilizer, and the world went into a bad situation. what I call the desperate years from the standpoint of food, from 72 to 75. Prices of food soared. Everyone was angry here in the USA as well as in other parts of the world. But it was a desperate situation in many countries where even in good times the purchasing power of the masses of the people spend 80% of their take-home pay or 85% on food, and then when prices shoot up like this, they spend all of it, and there still isn't enough. Now we're back into this complacency situation where the food stocks are building again. The frustrations that come to both political leaders and farm groups. At the World Food Conference in the worst of the crisis in 74, there were flowery speeches made that could never hopefully be fulfilled, such as no child will go to bed hungry by the year 1985. By the year 2000, hunger will be banished from the face of the earth. And I think these are completely irresponsible kinds of declarations when you see how the world really exists from the standpoint of shortage of food today. It can't be achieved. There were 3 objectives set. One, to build an international grain reserve that would presumably be financed by all nations in their abilities to contribute. Not much has come from that, nothing, except lots of talk. There was accomplished an increase in food aid for certain of the countries that were in grave crisis at that time. And then the International Fund for Agricultural Development was established, and about $1 billion has been accumulated, which is to be spent in development programs. The first few projects of this are now about to begin. Hopefully this will have some impact to help some of these countries develop their agriculture somewhat better. So we muddled through this crisis of the middle 70s. We didn't plan our way through it. We just plain muddled through. When we look at our own production here in the USA and contrast it to the yields in other countries, you say, why the great difference? First of all, the United States was blessed with a lot of good land where there's favorable climatic conditions, especially rainfall and temperatures, that permits good production. You had good farmers, and those farmers just didn't happen to be good farmers always, but your land-grant colleges and experiment stations provided the background information that, and through your extension systems, disseminated that information and the plant materials and animal materials that were produced by those experiment stations, funneled them into the hands of farmers, and they responded. Now that doesn't mean that they could have done this all alone. There was good investments in infrastructures, in roads and storage facilities, in machinery, all of the things that go to make the production that you enjoy now possible. The markets were developed in a fairly orderly way, and this too helped. There were economic policies that were encouragements to increase production. In the third world nations, they're short of all of these. Until very recently, there was shortage of technology, which you developed through research. And I would like to tell you a bit about the history of the one program that I was affiliated with, and now it's one of its descendants, as it were. The first attempt at foreign technical agricultural assistance was established in Mexico in 1943, a joint undertaking by the government of Mexico and the Rockefeller Foundation. The objectives were twofold: to train a whole new corps of agricultural scientists, Mexicans, as rapidly as possible to take over the responsibilities for developing their own agriculture, but in the process to establish a network of agricultural experiment stations, to do applied work on all aspects of or disciplines that impinge on food production in both plants and somewhat later in animals. Not in all crops, but in the most important ones. This program was an outgrowth really of sort of an interesting coming together of people interested in agriculture. When then Vice President Henry Wallace went to Mexico for the inauguration of the President Avila Camacho, he was invited to accompany the incoming Ministry of Agriculture, Engineer Martí Gomez, and the outgoing president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the man who was instrumental, or both of these men were instrumental in carrying out the agricultural reform after the Revolutionary War in Mexico in 1920. They traveled in the old parts of Mexico. At the end, Vice President Wallace, they made a request to him to assist them in this training and development of their agricultural research, and hopefully to expand their production of food. And he took it under consideration, and after he came back, he called the president of the Rockefeller Foundation at that time, Raymond Fosdick, and he said, "We have this request. I've reflected on it." This was, of course, by then the war had begun. He said, "We can't do anything about staffing this now, and you probably can't either, but you have had 25 years in working with 26 different governments around the world in public health, where you have stationed MDs, medical entomologists, and sanitation engineers. You've learned how to work with many governments in developing nations." And he said, "We in the U.S. government have no such experience. Besides, these issues become political if it's government to government. You are not political. Your institution is not." He said, "I suggest that you send a survey team to study the feasibility of this." And so 6 months or a year, 6 months, 9 months later, a 3-man team went to Mexico composed of Dr. E.C. Stegman, who recently passed away at the University of Minnesota, plant pathologist, my former professor, and Dr. Richard Bradfield, agronomist from Cornell University, and Dr. Paul Mangelsdorf, a Mace geneticist, originally from Texas A&M, but then at Harvard. They made this study. They made a positive recommendation that the Rockefeller Foundation accept the challenge to send a small group of agricultural scientists to see what could be done. That program was initiated in 1943 with Dr. J.G. Harrar, who subsequently became president of the Rockefeller Foundation and retired only a few years ago. The second man was Dr. E.J. Wellhausen, our corn geneticist, our first director of the International Center, and I was the third man on the team, and I'm the old graybeard and the only one left on the firing line at this time. What happened? It took from 1943 till 1960 to train at one level or another about 1,250 scientists. The best always were selected to train others. They were sent here to Kansas State University or other universities, first for a master's degree. They came back and they worked with us again to help train other young people. Many of them were sent out to government experiment stations to be posted there. Again, we searched for the best to send for completing their doctorate in American institutions, Canadian, Australian, and Western European institutions. They came back and they took over the program in 1960. And then we were out of the job. By then, most of our staff had been transferred to similar programs in Colombia, in India, and Chile. But some of them had come back to live in the USA. It so happened that in 1962, or in about 1958, there were many requests for similar types of assistance programs that came to the Rockefeller Foundation and to the Ford Foundation to establish programs in third world countries. There wasn't enough funds. They took it upon themselves to establish the first international agricultural research station, institute. The International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, the Philippines. in collaboration with the Philippine government. In 1962, this institute opened its doors, and a few months later, the then president, late President Lopez Mateos of Mexico, was making a swing through Southeast Asia. And at a farewell banquet for the few Rockefeller Foundation staff in September, I believe it was, of '62, he and his cabinet, the entire cabinet, were there to say farewell to the few of us who were still there assisting in the transfer of this program. And as he rose to speak, he said, "I'm completely confused by this." He said, "When I went through Southeast Asia, the president of the Philippines invited me to see this new agricultural international rice research institute. And it was fabulous, beautifully equipped, scientists going about their work with enthusiasm." And he said, "Then I learned that this was modeled after the Mexican wheat and maize program, the program that we're saying goodbye to here." And he says, "If this was so, then I insist and I will support, bring my support from the government of Mexico to establish an international maize and wheat center here so that we can hopefully repay some of the other, or help some other third world nations with their agricultural problems." About 2 or 3 years later, on paper, this was organized. Then it was a long period of trying to restaff. But in the interim, we turned our attention to other countries where we were working indirectly, in India, for example, and I'd like to. Let me complete this story about the international institutes. Today there are 9 of these in operation, scattered around the world. 7 work on agricultural crops, 2 work on animals. The 2 animal programs, one is the disease, International Livestock Disease Laboratories in Kenya. They're working especially on trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness. It's a very complicated thing, trying to see what they can do to unravel this. If this could be done, it would open vast tracts of land that are well watered in Central Africa that are now jungle. It's working on other animal diseases. The other animal program is sort of never got off the ground. It's in Ethiopia, and you know they've been fighting a bloody war still, which was part of that famine of the middle 70s when everything came unstuck, unglued. The others are in plants. One in the Philippines, in Mexico, tropical station in Colombia, South America, one in Nigeria, tropical agriculture, potato station in the highlands of Peru, dry land agriculture in southern India, for sorghums and millets primarily, and then a new one that's just trying to start. We had started to work in Lebanon. We were driven out, and they're in Aleppo, Syria at the present time, working also on dry land crops. Now, the technology that was developed, including the seed, a lot about the knowledge of use of fertilizer, although it has to be adapted to different soil types in different regions. Cultural practices, the problems of weeds and diseases and insects. We learned a lot about handling these in Mexico. We were able to very rapidly and I should say that in Mexico, in the case of wheat, when I first arrived, the yields were very low, about 11 bushels per acre. They went up rather fantastically, especially when we got to the level where we were using the semi-dwarfs. And I think at the present time, the average yield is about 56 bushels an acre. And in the better areas, it will run in most years 75 bushels an acre. Now, India and Pakistan were in grave crisis in the middle 60s. We began exploring the possibilities of transplanting some of this technology to those countries, and we sent in experimental lots of seed, worked with their scientists, tested them under a number of conditions. Some of them looked promising. We imported about 350 tons of seed into each country, and we had everything go wrong in that process. When we couldn't get it on the ship, but it had to be trucked out of Mexico. Got tangled up in the traffic jams outside of Los Angeles when the Watts riots were going on. Finally, we held the freighters and got the thing aboard, and I still had one check that nobody wanted to cash because it had a couple of misspelled names, and I told them load it and send it off. And the next afternoon, this was on a Friday afternoon, I'd get the check cashed on Monday morning. Sunday, the war was on between the two countries. And I had this check, and it seems that I was labeled the most miserable administrator that had ever hit Mexico by people in the New York office. And I thought it was a pretty good decision. And as it turned out, it was, but I had to live with that for a year and a half. The seed arrived, finally was separated in Singapore, a part going to India from the part going to Pakistan, and arrived too late to check the germination, so we started planting. I was on one side, and my colleague, Dr. Narvaez, in Pakistan, and Dr. Anderson, my Canadian colleague, who was my deputy at the present time, was in the Indian side. And all at once, after a week, we saw a miserable germination. And so then we had no choice except to go to the ministerial level and say, look, we have to double all the seeding rates, and it was already very expensive seed, and that didn't make us look good. And we still had about a third of the stand, and if I'd have had it back home in Mexico, I'd have disked it all up and started over again. And put on more fertilizer and more water, and eventually it turned out to be a good crop, and people had never seen such a good crop. But the whole thing hung by that thin a thread. That's the way life is in the developing nations. And when we track back what had happened, somebody had fumigated that seed back in Mexico at 3 times the recommended rate and killed it before it ever left. And so I knew about what was happening in Pakistan, but I had no way of contacting Anderson to see whether he'd seen it soon enough. On the Indian side, all we had across there were cannons at that time, firing at night. So you wire back to Mexico and tell your boss to wire India to tell him to look and see what kind of a mess he's got. Eventually, despite all of these things, it was successful. And then the next year, there were thousands of tons imported. But I should say that these 300 tons were put out on a half an acre plot next to the farmer's way he planted his wheat, whether fertilized or unfertilized, and we fertilized all of ours. And it just shook the Indian people. And the differences, not 50%, not 100%, but 3 or 4 times what they were getting. And then the job was to convince the politicians. And I had a good stroke of luck on this one. While I was en route back to India from northern India with Dr. Anderson and I, we visited all of these plots for about 3 weeks, and there was tremendous enthusiasm by the farmers especially. And we were invited to have lunch at the largest tractor factory just outside of Delhi. And it so happened that the Polish ambassador was there because that day, because the differentials on these tractors were sold by Poland. The rest of the tractor was made in India. And the patio was all full of tractors that they were unable to sell. And the ambassador spoke, and they asked me to say a few words, and so I took the advantage of this, and I said, if we can just get some fertilizer now, all of those small tractors you've got out here will disappear inside of a few months. And the whole critical thing now is fertilizer. And if I were a member of the Lok Sabha, which is their parliament, I say about every 15 minutes, irrespective of what they were discussing, I'd stand up and say, what India needs now is more fertilizer. Whether they're talking about foreign affairs or not, what India needs is more fertilizer. Well, that was on the front page of all of the press the next day in Delhi. And so So I went to see the minister, and I told him what we'd seen, and he was convinced. But he'd lost his seat in the by-elections that just about destroyed the whole Congress party, which finally came apart a couple of years ago. But that was the beginning rumblings. And he said, I can't help you. I didn't mind my politic, and I lost my seat, and now I'm out. But here, I want you to talk. I was leaving the next night at midnight from Mexico. He said, I want you to have an appointment with the Minister Ashoka Mehta, who is the second most potent man in the government at that time, after Indira Gandhi. So the appointment was set up, and as I was leaving Minister Subramaniam's office, I had my hand on the door, and he said, listen, Dr. Borlaug, you treat him just as bluntly as you do me. You've never met him, but the time is right to treat him bluntly now. I'd never met the man. And so I walked in and said, look, the whole stage is set now, but there's no fertilizer. And you, Mr. Minister, if there isn't fertilizer coming out the spouts next September, you'll join the lot of all the rest of the Congress party who lost their seat, because the farmers now know what can be done if there's fertilizer. Move, or they'll move you. That wasn't a very happy way to start, but there was lots of sparks flying around, and I kept talking so fast he couldn't interrupt me. He was talking too, but eventually we both quieted down, and when we left, we were pretty good friends. I left that night at midnight. About a week, 10 days later, I got a bunch of clippings out of the Delhi newspapers from the Ford Foundation. They said the next morning, the morning after this meeting, said that the government of India had modified its stance on all contracts on new fertilizer plants. It was extending for an indefinite period all negotiations for joint ventures, foreign capital, government of India capital, private sector, Indian government of India, and that opened the door. And fertilizer started coming, and what happened? The production of wheat in India, I will use the case of India to illustrate some of the changes, was 10.5 million tons in 1965-66 harvest. That's roughly 400,000 bushels, 390,000 bushels, million bushels. Last year it was 31.5 million metric tons. More than 3 times as much, from 66 to 78. A billion, in other words, what would it be? About 1,300,000,000 bushels. They got it piled all over. The warehouses are running over, but there's lots of empty stomachs. It's a different ballgame now. How do you get it from these warehouses into the stomachs of the unemployed and the underemployed people? Been prodding and pushing on that front now for a long time. And finally, they've got some public works programs like I perceive might be useful, like I saw here in the USA in our time of crisis in the mid-30s, under the Works Projects Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, which I was affiliated with as a young forester, work crews. And so they've started a campaign to build farm-to-market roads, country schoolhouses, drainage ditches, irrigation canals, by hand, most of it, replanting forest, eroded slopes, soil conservation. There's great opportunities. Now, whether this can be organized or not, I don't know. I hope that the economists rise to the cost, because I've been blistered now for many years by saying we've made the rich richer and the poor poorer, because we were never able to develop a technology that would produce 4 times as much on the plot of the land with the same technology that the small farmer had, 1 acre of land, and only 1/4 as much with the same technology on the land that the farmer that had 100 acres. That wheat plant is pretty apolitical. It doesn't respond. You treat it in the same way, and it doesn't care whether it's growing on a big farm or a small farm. It's apolitical. Then, of course, there were all sorts of things that were thrown at us about the injustices that was coming from this, when they should have been examining how to distribute the benefits from the additional production. You can't distribute something until you produce it. This gets all confused in our intellectual smog this day and age. It's not just in one country, it's everywhere in the world. Now the ball's over in their court. Let's see what happens. It's going to be very interesting. Now, when you're provoking these changes, you not only have to develop a technology, the seed, how to fertilize, what fertilizer, what doses and what rates, and the cropping systems that they fit into. I have worked primarily on wheat, but we're interested in all of them. But you've got to try to influence policy, such as input availability, the credit to buy the inputs, small farmer especially, the price of the product, and the seed organizations are always miserable. The extension services never function. The best the way that we got this done originally was to get all the research people off the experiment stations and out in the country, because they never went out there either. This is one of the grave defects of all of the developing nations. They receive a PhD degree, come back, lock themselves in the office all too often, don't want to face this ugly problem out on the land, where either you produce or you don't produce. And it's not unique to one country, it's a constant fight. And this is why we think these practical training programs to bring people, as we do now in Simmet, we bring about 100 young students who have received their first degree to work beside us, get dirty and sweaty and muddy and wet, depending on the weather, and learn to work with their hands to put some of that knowledge that they've got of theoretical nature from their academic degree to work, to produce more food to fill empty stomachs. It's a long, slow process. And those of you professors who are engaged in teaching students from developing nations, always remember that most of them have never lived a day of their life on the farm. They have a theoretical knowledge only. And the grave dangers are, if they come here, they will that for the jobs that need in those countries. Those agriculturally different stage of than those in the country such as that. So I'm going to wrap this. I say this: what for the research marketing prime the 13 different deficits, well, back in the 60s and early 70s, that were likely to be the big problem areas looking ahead 15 years. And their projections using the trend lines projected from the base period of 60 to 75 paint a dismal picture. Those countries, which includes India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, about 10 others, that had a deficit of about, in 75, 13 million tons of food, grain imports. By 1990, will need to import, according to their figures, 80 million tons, at least, to maintain. This is without correcting for population growth, or 115 million tons if you correct and maintain the same per capita consumption. Can it be done? If those figures were right, it probably couldn't be done. But what's wrong with them was that they used the 1960 to 75 line, and remember, nothing was happening in that part of the world. Take the case of India, till 68. And then there were 2 years when there was no fertilizer, 74 and 5, when the production actually dropped. Except for that, this is at an entirely different pitch, and they've become self-sufficient. They've got this piled around, and if there's the political will, and if they organize themselves, and if they control diseases and insect pests, they can continue to produce more food than they will need for the next 15 or 20 years. Whether they do that is another matter, because political instabilities is the first enemy of the hungry, and it's so all over the world. And as we look ahead at all of this, we would like to say that there are many other things that can upset all of this. Inflation is a good case in point. I have seen in my 35 years in Mexico the little Switzerland of the Americas destroyed by inflation, Uruguay. In the early 1940s, it had a government very much like that of Switzerland, run by a committee. It had no prime minister, no president, a rotating chairmanship, a very democratic society. They passed very advanced legislation, early retirement, unemployment insurance, public health plans, very advanced for their time, much more advanced than that of the USA at that time. And what happened? When the price, remember, they only had 4 exports. They have no mineral resources. They exported wool, mutton, beef, and wheat. And at the end of World War II, when the prices collapsed, how could they sustain these programs? How could they finance them? Printed paper money. What happened? You know what happened. The guerrillas nearly took over. Then the military finally took over, and they lost their democracy. The situation was essentially the same in Chile, but the commodity base there was even less. Very advanced social legislation. One product, copper. So democracies can be lost and eaten away, eroded away, and then explode if inflation can do this. So never underestimate. This is a social cancer. Now, whether they can produce the things that are needed also will depend a great deal on the pest control chemicals. Today we have a big surge of environmentalists that we're all going to die from cancer, this, that, and the other. We need to remember that we don't die from many of the things that we died from in youth and childhood before. So we've removed this sector of causes of death, and now we're finding out that there's some other things that come on later in life, but maybe some of us who will probably die from cancer would have died from one of these other things in a few decades ago. So it's hard to put a value on all of this. But it looks so simple that to some people that we don't need chemicals. We can breed for disease resistance. Well, I've spent a lifetime at that, and I've seen these rusts change and varieties become susceptible, and it's going to continue to be that way. We need to try to use biological controls when they'll work, but look what happened on our tussock moth out in Oregon and Washington and Idaho when some of the environmentalists want to insist that you shouldn't use chemicals, and we ended up with about 400,000 hectares or acres of killed timber when we were waiting for the biological control to take over, when the foresters were handicapped or handcuffed. We look at the biological control in the most outstanding cases, the one of control of rabbits in Australia by myxomatosis virus. When it was introduced in the 50s, it killed off 98 or 99.9% of all the rabbits in the first year when it was turned loose. But what happened? Soon there were more rabbits starting to come back, build up resistance. And not only that, they build up resistance because the virus is unstable, it mutated to produce a strain that was not highly damaging, benign, and the rabbits would get this, they'd produce antibodies, they'd recover, they'd be resistant. It drove the virulent strains out of existence. They put them back in, and the same thing has been repeated time and time again. And so what are they doing now? Just like they did before. They continue to use myxomatosis virus as one arm in the battle against the rabbits there. But they're back to poisoning and shooting and trapping and digging up the burrows. Nature has got lots of built-in devices for protecting itself. And if we aren't careful, we too will fall victims of oversimplification. The male sterile technique that's been used very beautifully in control of Cochlear maya hominivirax, which is the screwworm of cattle and all warm-blooded animals in the semi-tropic southern U.S. The U.S. Department of Agriculture in Nipling and Bushland has done a magnificent job in cleaning out that pest with learning to rear hundreds of millions of these flies each week, sterilizing them with cobalt bomb, turning them loose, and the female only mates once. And when she mates with one of these sterile males, the eggs that she lays, the embryo is still alive, but it dies before it hatches. And that's a nasty, dirty trick that they're playing on that particular insect. But I have a feeling that they had some things that started to look like maybe they weren't all so, maybe these things were coming back too. So they went out and collected some more males down in Mexico, more flies, and started another strain. They said that this one is more macho. It's a better Mexican aggressive male. And we'll see how long this will last. But in any case, this is beautiful. But it only will work on a species that has low density in the natural habitat. The female mates only once. She can't be promiscuous. Then we have these female perfumes, these pheromones that are new, and they offer interesting promise. What I'm saying is that we have to use all of these devices, not one, and we will need to use chemicals. Remember, chemicals are like medicine. When you're sick, you go to the doctor. If he diagnoses your illness, you take the medicine that he prescribes properly, you'll probably be cured. If you take it improperly, it'll probably kill you. And so it is with agricultural chemicals. In closing, I would like to say this. I'm going to read this page or so. Although I've been primarily concerned with agriculture and food production, I have, by necessity, developed interest in the broad fields of land use or misuse and demography. If one is involved in food production, it naturally follows that one must be concerned about the land base upon which we depend for food production and the number of people that the land base must feed. 98% of the tonnage of food production worldwide in '75 was produced on the land. Anyone engaged in attempting to increase the world food production soon comes to realize that the human misery resulting from world food shortages and world population growth are part of the same problem. In effect, they are two different sides of the same coin. Unless these two interrelated problems and the energy problem are brought into better balance within the next several decades, the world will become increasingly more chaotic. And I'm worried by all these big cars, 3 or 4 in each garage. And people don't seem to realize there's an energy shortage close at hand. The social, economic, and political pressures and the strife are building at different rates in different countries of the world, depending upon human population density and growth rates, and upon the natural resource base that sustains the different economies. The poverty in many of the developing nations will become unbearable. There is also every likelihood that the standards of living in many of the affluent nations will stagnate or may even retrogress. My question is, are we tough enough if we have to give up some of the nice things? Are we tough enough as a nation to do so? The terrifying human population pressure will adversely affect the quality of life, if not the actual survival of the bald eagle, the stork, the crocodile, wolf, the wily beast, wolves, moose, caribou, elephants, tigers, you name it, whales, and baboons. Unfortunately, even in privileged, affluent, well-educated nations such as the USA, we have recently concerned ourselves unduly with the symptoms of this complex malaise that threatens civilization rather than with the basic underlying causes. In recent years, we seem to have become determined to attack all of these ugly symptoms by passing new laws or filing lawsuits against companies, individuals, or various government agencies for polluting the environment. Most of these lawsuits just fatten the incomes of lawyers without solving the basic problems. Most of us are either afraid to or not willing to recognize, confront, and effectively fight the underlying cause of most of this malaise, the human population monster. The longer we wait before attacking the primary cause of this problem worldwide with a serious, intelligent, unemotional, effective, and humane approach, the fewer of our present species of fauna and flora will survive. There is still heated debate about the date that man or near man appeared on the planet Earth. Evidence indicates that he's been roaming the earth for at least 3 million years. About 12,000 years ago, humans, I say a Neolithic woman, discovered agriculture and domesticated the animals when the old man wasn't bringing the meat home to the cave with great frequency. She had to go to work and did the job. At that time, world population has been estimated to be about 15 million. With the stable food supply, the population growth accelerated. It doubled 4 times to arrive at 250 million at the time of Christ. Since the time of Christ, the first doubling to 500 million occurred in 1650 years. The second doubling required only 200 years to arrive at a population of 1 billion, which was about the time of the beginning of modern medicine and the knowledge of the infectious nature of diseases. Death rates then begin to drop. The third doubling after the time of Christ to 2 billion occurred in 1930, required 80 years, about the time of the discovery of antibiotics, or first sulfa drugs and antibiotics, and then death rate plummeted again. And the fourth doubling occurred by 1975, in 45 years. That represented, from the beginning of agriculture, 8 doublings, or an increase of 256-fold the beginning population of that period. It's obvious that the food population ratio and the competition between species is worsening dramatically as the number of humans increase frighteningly. And the interval between doubling and human population continues to shorten. At the current rate of population growth, populations will double again in 40 years, reaching 8 billion souls by 2015. This means that in the next 40 years, world food and fiber production must be increased more than it was increased in the 12,000-year period from the discovery of agriculture up to 1975. In other words, from 3.3 billion metric tons to 6.6 without improving the lot of the hungry, per capita wise. It clearly indicates the urgency of dealing effectively and humanely with the human population monster. This is a tremendous undertaking and of vital importance to the future of civilization. Failure will plunge the world into economic, social, and political chaos. Can the production of food and fiber be doubled in the next 40 years? I believe it can, providing world governments gives high enough priority and continuing support to food and agriculture. It cannot be achieved with the miserable, discontinuous support that has been given to agriculture and forestry in the last 50 years. We must expand our scientific knowledge and improve and apply better technology if we are to make our finite land and water resources more productive. This must be done promptly and in an orderly way if we are to meet the growing needs without at the same time unnecessarily degrading the environment and crowding many species into extinction. Today, we hear a great deal about human rights. It's a utopian issue and a noble goal to work toward. But it can never be achieved as long as hundreds of millions of poverty-stricken people in the world lack the basic necessities of life. The right to dissent. For whom? The elitist, the educated, the privileged. Doesn't mean much to the person with an empty stomach, a shirtless back, a roofless dwelling, the frustrations and fear of unemployment and poverty, the lack of education and opportunity, and the pain, misery, and loneliness of sickness without medical care. My work has brought me in close contact with such people, and I've come to believe that all who are born into the world have the moral rights for the basic ingredients of a decent, humane life. How many should be born and how fast they should come on the stage is another matter. This latter question requires the best thinking and effort of all of us. If, in my opinion, we are to survive as a world in which our children and their children will want to live, and more important, be able to live in. Scientists and educators can no longer remain aloof from these problems. We must influence political and religious leaders to turn and face up to the population monster, or lose the game by default. It's later than most of us are willing to think. Thank you.